always believed the worst betrayal came from strangers, until my daughter smiled while stealing everything I ever earned. My name is Margaret Ellison. I'm 63, a retired school teacher, a widow, a mother, and until 3 weeks ago, I believed I had a quiet, uneventful life. But life has a strange way of turning ordinary into terrifying. It started with a knock on the door. My daughter Jenna, arms full of tulips, her husband Scott with a crooked smile. "Just visiting, Mom," she said. But behind the hugs and sugary tones, something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. They asked about the house, the savings, my will. Their eyes sparkled, not with love, but calculation. I smiled politely. I offered tea, and I silently activated the tiny camera hidden behind the bookshelf. That's when everything changed. You think your family would never betray you? So did I. Keep watching. The kettle whistled, sharp and lonely in the quiet kitchen. Margaret Ellison moved slowly toward it, her knees aching with the kind of pain that creeps up quietly after 60. She turned off the stove, poured the water into her favorite chipped mug, and sat at the small table facing the garden, now overgrown, its once pristine flower beds tangled in weeds. The Ellison house, a sturdy 3-bedroom Victorian at the edge of town, had once pulsed with life. Children's laughter had once echoed down its hallways. The aroma of roast chicken and freshly baked cornbread used to drift through on Sundays. Margaret used to think the walls themselves carried memories. But now, at 63, those walls mostly echoed silence. She took a careful sip, her eyes scanning the yard. That swing by the oak tree, her husband Richard built it for Jenna on her 7th birthday. He hadn't been a builder by trade, just stubborn. Stubborn enough to climb a ladder and fix the roof one rainy October, insisting they didn't need to waste money on professionals. One slip, one fall, one life gone. She never told Jenna the truth about how much guilt she carried. If Richard hadn't been trying to save the money she insisted on setting aside for Jenna's tuition, he might still be here. Margaret buried that guilt with him, next to the oak, beneath a plaque Jenna never visited. She ran a hand through her gray-streaked hair, now tied in a messy bun. The morning light fell softly on the faded linoleum floor. It had been almost 12 years since Richard passed, and Margaret had carried the weight of the house, her finances, and Jenna's dreams on her shoulders alone. She remembered the offer. The district had asked her to apply for the principal position. Twice. It was a natural promotion. Everyone expected her to say yes. But at the time, Jenna was struggling in college, on the verge of failing. Margaret thought, maybe if I were home more, I could help her study, cook her real meals, make her feel stable. So she declined the offer. Then came Scott, the charming young man with big plans and empty pockets. Margaret had misgivings early on, but Jenna was in love. And when Scott asked for a loan to start his own business, Margaret, ever the mother, liquidated one of Richard's small investment accounts. "Only for you, honey," she remembered saying. "Don't disappoint me." Now 15 years later, Scott's company had folded, rebranded, folded again. Jenna and Scott lived in a sleek condo 2 cities away, sent birthday cards and made quick holiday visits, always too quick. She saw them maybe once every 2 months, sometimes less. Jenna always arrived with a whirlwind of perfume and polished nails, air kisses and rushed apologies. "Mom, you really should sell this place. It's too big for you," Jenna said last Christmas, glancing distastefully at the worn wallpaper. "And that garden? Ugh, it's like a jungle." Margaret remembered biting her tongue. It wasn't worth the argument. She was used to the pattern now. Jenna showing up, offering suggestions disguised as criticisms, then disappearing again. "She means well," Margaret often whispered to herself, but the words felt hollower each year. Lately, Jenna had taken to calling less, and when she did, the tone was clipped. "You really should get someone to help you manage your finances, Mom," she had said in her last call. "You're not getting any younger." Margaret's hand tightened around her mug. "I'm doing just fine, thank you." There was a time Jenna would curl beside her on the couch and beg for another story about how Margaret met Richard. Now her daughter barely stayed long enough for coffee. The house felt colder today. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was something deeper, a kind of quiet grief that had settled over time, heavy but invisible. Margaret rose from the table, her joints protesting, and made her way to the living room. On the mantel sat a photo of her, Richard, and baby Jenna at the town fair. She picked it up, tracing Jenna's tiny face with a finger. "You were everything to us," she whispered. "Still are, even if you don't see it." Her eyes welled, but she blinked the tears away. There was still laundry to fold, mail to sort, dinner to cook. Life didn't stop for old wounds. Outside, a car honked in the distance. The town moved on. People hurried, lived, forgot. But Margaret stayed. She kept the house. She remembered. And maybe, she thought, maybe that was her sacrifice. Not just the jobs she turned down, the money she gave up, or the man she buried, but being forgotten in the end. The knock at the door startled Margaret. She wasn't expecting anyone that morning. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and shuffled toward the entryway. Through the stained glass panel, she could make out a familiar silhouette. Jenna, holding a bouquet of yellow tulips. Beside her stood Scott, tall and composed, a pastry box tucked under one arm. "Surprise, Mom!" Jenna beamed as the door opened. "We brought you breakfast." Margaret blinked, momentarily disoriented. "It's Wednesday," she said quietly. "You never visit midweek." "Well," Jenna laughed lightly, brushing past her into the living room, "we figured we'd shake things up. Scott had a light morning and I had an early call, so why not pop in?" Scott offered a smile. "Morning, Margaret. We brought those blueberry scones you like." Margaret stood there, still holding the doorknob, suspicion already creeping into her chest like a draft. The table was quickly set. Jenna moved with uncharacteristic efficiency, arranging tulips in the chipped vase, fluffing the throw pillows on the couch. Scott poured tea like a practiced butler. Margaret sat slowly, watching them. Something felt off. Jenna's makeup was perfect, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. Scott's gestures were warm, but his gaze lingered on the fireplace, the grandfather clock, the family photos, almost as if cataloging the place. Jenna took a sip of tea. "Mom, I've been thinking, this house is just too much for you. It's not safe. Stairs, old plumbing, God knows what molds in the attic." Margaret's grip on her teacup tightened. "We've talked about this, sweetheart," she replied carefully. "I'm comfortable here. This is my home." "But Mom," Jenna said, her voice turning shrill, "it's the third time this year you've fallen behind on the heating repairs, and last week you told me you had to call the plumber again." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "I didn't tell you that." Jenna blinked. "Didn't you? Oh, maybe I heard it from Scott." Scott raised his brows slightly, saying nothing, just nodding. "I appreciate your concern," Margaret continued, "but I've managed for 12 years. I'll be fine." Jenna's tone turned urgent. "But what if something happens to you and no one knows for days? That neighbor of yours, Mrs. Conway, she's 81 and just got moved into a lovely assisted community." "I'm not Mrs. Conway." There was a pause. Jenna's features tightened. "You're being difficult, Mom." "And you're being persistent," Margaret countered, though her tone remained calm. Then Jenna's face shifted. Her jaw trembled slightly, and she pressed a napkin to her cheek. "I just worry about you. You're my mother. I love you. I don't want to see you struggling alone." It was almost convincing. Margaret reached across the table and patted her daughter's hand. "I know you mean well, but I'm not ready to leave this house." Jenna withdrew her hand sharply. "You're being stubborn again, like always." Scott flinched slightly at the raised voice, but said nothing. His eyes, however, glinted, sharp and assessing. Margaret caught his gaze and held it. Something behind those eyes made her skin prickle. The conversation drifted toward neutral topics after that. Jenna recounted a story about her co-worker's engagement. Scott commented on property values in their neighborhood. Margaret nodded politely, responding here and there, all while mentally replaying every line they had said earlier. When they finally stood to leave, Jenna leaned in to hug her. The tulip petals brushed Margaret's cheek. "Please think about what I said, Mom. We just want you to be safe." "I will," Margaret said softly, though she had no intention to. As Jenna pulled away, something slipped from her purse, an envelope, half tucked into a folder. It fluttered to the ground near Margaret's feet. Jenna didn't notice. Margaret bent slowly, picking it up. "Oh, sorry." Jenna laughed nervously, snatching it quickly. "Just bills. You know how it is." But Margaret had already seen it. A photocopy of a document angled just enough for her to catch a few haunting words. Power of attorney. And beneath it, in faint ink, her name, her signature. Except she had never signed such a thing. She forced a smile. "Take care, darling." They left in a flurry of smiles and casual waves. Margaret watched from the window as they climbed into their dark SUV. The engine roared to life, and within seconds they were gone. Only then did her knees buckle slightly. She sat back down at the kitchen table, the scone untouched, the tulips too bright against the pale wallpaper. Her mind was racing. Why would Jenna carry a forged power of attorney? Who else knew about it? How long had they been planning whatever this was? And suddenly, the warmth of the morning vanished, replaced by a chilling realization. She wasn't just imagining things anymore. Something was truly wrong. The next morning, Margaret was up before dawn, her sleep fractured by flashes of Jenna's face and the image of that forged signature. She made her tea with shaking hands, each clink of porcelain a sharp jab to her nerves. She didn't wait. By 9:00 a.m., she was at the Fall Ridge Community Bank, the same institution she had trusted for 35 years. She knew the tellers by name. They knew her as the woman who always brought homemade shortbread in December. "Good morning, Mrs. Ellison," said Brandon, a young assistant manager with neatly parted hair and a soft, rehearsed smile. "Brandon," she nodded, her tone firmer than usual. "I need to check my safe deposit box." "Of course," he said, tapping the computer. "Any reason for concern?" "Routine," Margaret replied evenly. Moments later, Brandon led her down the narrow hallway to the secured vault. The cool air and thick silence inside always unsettled her. She slipped the key into the lock and turned. A soft click. The box slid out. Inside were her bonds, her marriage certificate, Elaine's will, and a velvet pouch containing her mother's brooches. Everything appeared untouched. Margaret exhaled. For now, at least. But Brandon hesitated by the door. "Mrs. Ellison, if you don't mind me asking..." She turned. "Yes?" "There was a request filed last week," he said slowly, choosing his words. "For a duplicate key to your box." Her chest tightened. "What kind of request?" He looked uncomfortable. "Standard form. Claimed the original was lost. The requester said they were acting as your legal guardian." Margaret's voice was sharp. "What name?" "I'm not at liberty to say." Brandon glanced around. "But I will say this much. It wasn't random. It was someone who knew your full name, account details, your late husband's file." Margaret stared at him. "Family." He didn't answer, just gave a slight, regretful nod. It took everything in her not to tremble. "Was the key issued?" "No," Brandon said. "We follow protocol. Because you're the primary holder, we sent a letter to your home. You didn't respond, so we froze the request." She hadn't seen any letter. But then again, Jenna had come over, unscheduled, just this week. Margaret thanked Brandon, finished her business, and left the vault with her box locked tight. But the air outside felt different, heavier, as if her quiet life was beginning to split at the seams. On the way home, she stopped by an electronics store. A young clerk showed her how to install a small wireless camera disguised as a wall hook. She bought two. Then she drove to the community library, logged into a public computer, and changed her online bank passwords. Back home, she moved every important document, wills, account summaries, deeds, into a sealed envelope and hid it inside an old coffee tin. She then drove to her former colleague Edith's house and handed her the tin. "Don't ask," Margaret said. "I won't," Edith replied, closing the cupboard door. "But you let me know if you need more than storage." Margaret smiled faintly. "I may." By the time she returned home, dusk had settled over the street. She installed one camera in the study and one near the front door. Both fed live to an app on her phone. As she adjusted the lens behind a decorative wall hook, she caught her reflection in the glass. Not the reflection of a fragile old woman. Not today. A mother, a widow, a woman who had spent her entire life caring for others. And now, she was alone, and finally seeing things for what they were. That evening, she sat in her armchair watching the fireplace flicker. The tulips from Jenna still sat in the vase, bright and silent. Their perfume filled the room, too sweet, almost cloying, like Jenna's voice, like Scott's perfect manners. Perfume and poison often wore the same scent. Margaret stared at the flowers, her mind spiraling back to the day her husband died, falling off the roof because they couldn't afford to hire help. How Jenna cried at the funeral but barely visited since. How Scott once joked about how expensive the house was to maintain, even back then. And now someone wanted access to her assets. Behind her back, her fingers curled tightly around the armrest. She wasn't imagining things, not anymore. An unease settled deep in her bones. A quiet dread, the sense that something larger had already begun unfolding, and she was just starting to see its edges. The next morning, Margaret's phone rang. It was Jenna. Her voice was soaked in tears. "Mom, I didn't sleep all night." Margaret held the phone in silence. "I've been so worried about you. Scott and I, we're scared you might fall for a scam. You know these stories, people pretending to be financial advisors or fake charities. You're so trusting sometimes." Margaret's tone was steady. "I'm fine." "You say that, but you don't know what's out there. That's why I filed the power of attorney form. It's just precaution, Mom, so I can step in if something goes wrong." Margaret blinked. "You filed it?" "Yes, but just as a draft. It's not legal yet, I swear. I was going to talk to you about it. But then the bank called and they said if you lost your key or something happened, well, we didn't want to take chances. You know I love you." Margaret didn't reply, not immediately. She stared at the vase of tulips. The petals were beginning to curl at the edges. "I have to go," she said finally. "We'll talk later." An hour passed before another call came. This time it was Scott. "Margaret," he began, polite as ever. "Just a quick update. The bank's compliance department flagged your file for routine verification. Nothing serious. It happens with senior accounts sometimes. They'll probably need a face-to-face or maybe even a reauthorization of access. We can help set that up." Margaret gritted her teeth. "I haven't requested anything. Neither verification nor assistance." "Oh no, of course not," Scott chuckled. "But sometimes systems prompt things on their own. It's all to protect you. Nothing to worry about." Margaret ended the call without saying goodbye. She sat at the kitchen table, her tea untouched. Then she picked up her phone again and called Gloria Whitaker, her old college roommate, now a real estate attorney in Brookline. "Gloria," Margaret said without preamble, "I need a favor. Can you run a background check on my property, see if anything's been flagged, accessed, or filed, especially anything related to viewing rights or ownership change?" "Of course," Gloria replied. "Give me an hour." It took less than that. At 10:42 a.m., Gloria called back. "Margaret, someone's been poking around your records." Margaret's stomach dropped. "There's a pre-clearance tag placed on your deed," Gloria continued. "It's listed as early market viewing rights. Someone filed paperwork indicating a potential listing, just a step before putting a house on the market." "I didn't approve anything," Margaret said through clenched teeth. "I know, that's why it stood out. And here's the kicker. It was done through a firm called Eastgate Residential Advisors." Margaret froze. Scott's former employer. Gloria added, "They listed a Scott L. Witherspoon as an affiliated party on the form." Margaret thanked her and hung up. Her pulse throbbed in her ears. Her house, her home, the place where she had raised Jenna, buried her husband, and kept every photo, every story, every memory. They were trying to sell it out from under her. She needed air. Margaret stepped onto the porch, breathing in the sharp, late autumn chill. Her phone rang again. She almost didn't answer, but the number was unfamiliar. "Hello?" she said warily. "Mrs. Ellison?" a cheerful woman's voice chirped. "This is Rhonda from Maplewood Horizons Assisted Living. We're calling to confirm your wellness check scheduled for Thursday at 10:00 a.m. Margaret's spine stiffened. "Excuse me?" "Your daughter, Jenna Witherspoon, arranged a preliminary intake evaluation. It's standard practice. We'll just go over your health history, medications, cognition baseline. I didn't authorize any visit," Margaret said sharply. "Oh, I was under the impression this was all coordinated." Mrs. Witherspoon signed the family consent forms. "Is Thursday still okay?" Margaret hung up. Her hands shook. Her heart pounded. Not just betrayal now, but intrusion. An invasion of her autonomy, her sanity, her very self. She paced the living room, rage and fear colliding inside her chest. They were preparing a case, a quiet campaign to have her deemed unfit, so they could control her estate, her decisions, her life. It was a playbook, one she'd seen on television, read in books, but never imagined would be used against her, by her own child. She grabbed her phone and opened the security camera feed. Nothing suspicious yet, but every second now felt like a countdown. The image of Jenna's tear-filled eyes replayed in her mind. The trembling voice, the pretense of love, perfume and poison. Margaret sat down slowly. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was a war for her future, and she would not go quietly. By Wednesday morning, Margaret had stopped pretending things would get better on their own. She dialed a number she hadn't used in years. "Henry," she said, when the gruff voice answered. "It's Margaret Ellison. I need a favor." Henry Bauer was once her late husband's best friend, a retired police inspector with a sharp eye and a deep mistrust of charm. "I figured something was wrong the second I saw your name," he said. "What's going on?" Margaret explained everything. Jenna's surprise visits, the fake paperwork, the calls from the nursing home, the unauthorized listing of her house. Henry didn't interrupt once. "You have any security at home?" he asked when she finished. "Just locks," she admitted. "That won't cut it." By late afternoon, Henry had driven to Fall River himself, his car trunk loaded with surveillance equipment, discreet minicams, motion sensors, cloud backups. As they worked together to install them, one above the study door, another behind the bookshelf, and one angled toward the main hallway, Margaret felt a strange comfort in Henry's presence. Calm, focused, no judgment. "You always were the strongest of the two," Henry said quietly as he calibrated a lens. "But even steel needs allies." That evening, Margaret cooked stew for two. For the first time in days, she smiled genuinely. But peace didn't last long. It was 2:16 a.m. when the notification buzzed on Henry's phone. Movement detected, Zone 3. Henry, ever the detective, was already dressed. He tapped Margaret's shoulder and they watched the live feed from her laptop screen in the kitchen. Jenna. And Scott. Margaret covered her mouth. The pair slipped through the back door using a key. Margaret's spare key. Hidden in the ceramic goose behind the rose bushes. Jenna used to laugh at how old-fashioned it was. Clearly, she hadn't forgotten. Scott wore gloves. Jenna didn't. She seemed agitated, whispering sharply. They made their way directly to the study. Henry adjusted the camera view, capturing the moment Jenna opened the bottom desk drawer and pulled out folders. Scott flicked through them like he was flipping through a magazine. Margaret's breath caught when she saw Scott pause. He held up a folded piece of paper. She knew that paper. 10 years ago, after Harold passed, she had written a will by hand. It was sentimental, incomplete, legally non-binding, but heartfelt. In it, she left everything to Jenna, with phrases like, "To my beloved daughter," and "the one who carries my heart forward." She had forgotten it was even in that drawer. Now Scott read it with a smirk. He showed it to Jenna, who clutched his arm and kissed his cheek. Henry narrowed his eyes. "They think this gives them leverage." Margaret stood slowly. Rage pulsed through her veins like a rising tide. Her fists clenched at her sides. "That document isn't legal," she whispered. "I made a new one 2 years ago. Through Gloria. Everything is split between charity and a scholarship fund in Harold's name. They don't know that, Henry said calmly. On screen, Scott folded the old will carefully and slid it into his coat pocket. Are we letting them go? Margaret asked. For now, Henry replied. We need to let this play out further. The more rope they pull, the easier it'll be to hang them with it. Margaret nodded, though every bone in her body screamed for confrontation. As they watched Jenna and Scott leave the house as stealthily as they entered, Margaret felt something inside her snap. Not fear, not sadness, but betrayal sharpening into fury. She had loved Jenna more than she loved herself. Skipped promotions to be home after school, sold heirlooms to pay Jenna's college tuition, lied to Harold about how much she lent Scott for his startup, forgiven every slight, every cold shoulder, every missed birthday. And now her daughter was robbing her while she slept. The smile Jenna gave Scott on the camera, it wasn't the smile of a grateful daughter. It was the smile behind the knife. Margaret's lips thinned. They don't get to win. Margaret stared at her reflection in the mirror, applying blush to cheeks she had deliberately let pale. She was thinner now, less from age and more from planning. She dialed Jenna's number with a voice trembling just enough to sound genuine. "Sweetheart," she whispered. "I've been feeling off, faint, dizzy. Maybe you were right." The pause on the other end felt like Jenna was trying not to exhale too loud. "Mom, I'm so glad you're saying this." Margaret smiled faintly to herself. "Maybe it's time. I want to talk about arrangements, for the house, for everything. I need help." "Of course," Jenna replied too quickly. "We'll come by tonight." That evening, Jenna brought a bowl of chicken soup and Scott brought a briefcase. Margaret stayed curled on the couch, hand resting dramatically on her stomach. "We found someone," Jenna said, brushing Margaret's hair gently. "A legal advisor. Very discreet. We can go tomorrow morning just to talk things through." Margaret nodded weakly. "That sounds good, honey." But she'd already arranged her own appointment. At 10 a.m., Margaret sat in a sleek office in downtown Fall River, across from Jenna and Scott, flanked by two men in tailored suits. "This is Attorney Claiborne," Jenna said, too brightly, "and that's his assistant, Liam." Margaret nodded feebly. "Thank you for helping. I just want my daughter to be safe in case anything happens to me." Claiborne offered a warm smile. "We understand, ma'am. We've prepared some simple paperwork, mostly power of attorney. Standard stuff. You'll still retain full rights, but in an emergency." "Of course," Margaret said. "May I review them first?" Scott shifted uncomfortably. Jenna leaned forward. "Don't worry, Mom. It's just standard boilerplate. We've done all the reading." Still, Margaret pulled out her glasses. Her fingers trembled slightly as she flipped through the documents. Then she paused. A paper in the stack, slightly off-white, not part of the binder clip. Different font, different formatting. Her eyes didn't betray her. Jenna's expression didn't either. It was too controlled. Margaret handed the stack to Claiborne. "Can we run this through your document verification software just to be sure I'm not signing anything unusual?" Jenna laughed nervously. "Mom, seriously?" Claiborne glanced at the page in question. "Certainly." He fed it through a scanner connected to his laptop. Seconds ticked by. Liam stood beside him, reading the results. Then Claiborne's face changed. Barely, but enough. "This document was inserted between pages 5 and 6, he said. "It's a power of attorney transfer signed, apparently by Margaret Ellison. However, the signature does not match the handwriting sample we took earlier." Scott's jaw twitched. Jenna tilted her head. "What are you saying?" "It's not a match," Liam added. "It was scanned and printed from a prior source. Not hand-signed today. Possibly not even signed by the same person." Jenna's voice went cold. "My mother signed that. She's confused. She's been forgetting things." Margaret leaned forward. "I haven't forgotten a thing, especially not when it comes to my name." Jenna's lips thinned. "Mom, you had dizzy spells. You said so yourself." Margaret folded her arms. "I faked those, all of it. I wanted to see what you'd do." Scott stood abruptly. "This is entrapment. You came in here with forged documents," Claiborne said sharply. "That's attempted fraud." Suddenly, the door opened. Two plainclothes officers entered. Detective Reyes and her partner from financial crimes. "This isn't just a law office," Margaret said calmly. "It's a satellite branch of the State Investigative Unit, and everything that just happened has been recorded." For a moment, no one breathed. Then Jenna's mask cracked. "You manipulative old woman," she hissed. "You set us up." "I protected myself," Margaret replied. But then the unexpected happened. Reyes looked down at the printed paper and sighed. "We're going to have to process this carefully. If there's no proof Jenna knew the document was fraudulent or didn't insert it herself, she may walk." Margaret's jaw clenched. "What? The law protects intent?" Reyes said gently. "If she claims confusion or that she believed it was real and there's no witness placing the page in her hands—" Jenna's eyes sparkled with cold triumph. Scott stepped back, silent. Margaret's heart sank, not because of the setback, but because of what it confirmed. Jenna had come prepared for every angle. The morning sun filtered through lace curtains, casting pale golden shapes across Margaret's teacup. Her fingers curled around the warm porcelain, but her thoughts were far away, back to a time when the girl who called her Mom still held a shred of gratitude in her voice. The betrayal cut deeper than she'd anticipated, so she called someone who once looked up to her with wide eyes and untamed curiosity. Sarah Kim, a former student who now carried a Juris Doctorate and a fierce reputation in estate law. Sarah arrived 2 hours later, walking through the garden Margaret and her late husband once planted together. "You still have that old wind chime," Sarah smiled. "It used to scare me during pop quizzes." Margaret laughed softly. "It's scared off worse things now." They embraced briefly. Sarah's energy was sharp, protective. "I heard bits," she said, sitting down and opening her notepad. "Let's get everything legal, official, and airtight." Margaret explained everything. Jenna, Scott, the fake documents, the near escape. Sarah's eyes sharpened. "We'll rewrite your will immediately. Do you have an old one?" Margaret nodded and handed over the outdated document, the one Scott had dug up with the words, "Everything to my only daughter," scribbled in her careful pen. "Burn this emotionally, not legally," Sarah said. "We'll draft something that reflects who you are now, who you've become since losing Mr. Ellison." Margaret took a deep breath. "I want the house donated. I want 80% of my estate to go to a scholarship fund for teachers in underprivileged districts. Call it the Thomas Ellison Fund. He always said good teachers needed good chances." Sarah nodded with a smile. "What about the remaining 20? Enough to care for me, the rest, maybe a small trust for the animal shelter. I want no penny to fall into Jenna's hands." It took them 2 days to finish everything. Margaret signed the new documents with a firm hand and a clear heart. Peace, for the first time, curled at the edges of her grief, until the letter arrived. A thick envelope, official and ugly, with Jenna's return address scrawled in the corner in angry loops. Margaret slid it open with trembling fingers and unfolded the pages inside. At the top was the seal of a law office Margaret had never heard of, Haskins, Dillard, and Rowe. The letter accused Margaret of cognitive decline, citing worrisome changes in behavior and inconsistent testimonies regarding her estate. Jenna was petitioning the court to declare Margaret legally unfit to manage her own assets. She wanted to be appointed guardian, with full control over her mother's finances, property, and medical decisions. Margaret read the words 3 times. It felt like an out-of-body experience. She gripped the table, breathing unevenly. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was war. The phone rang. It was Sarah. "I just got a copy," she said without greeting. "We'll contest it. This is nothing but smoke and mirrors, Margaret." "Smoke has choked people before," Margaret whispered. Sarah paused. "She's doubling down because she knows you've shut the door." "I thought shutting the door would protect me," Margaret replied. "But she's breaking the lock." They scheduled an immediate appointment with a neurologist and a psychiatrist, both state certified. Margaret underwent a full battery of tests over the next week. Her memory, reasoning, and comprehension all returned with results better than expected for someone her age. But Jenna's lawyers were clever. They submitted dated journal entries, old voicemails of Margaret complaining of headaches or saying, "I forgot why I came into the kitchen." And they even submitted prescriptions, blood pressure meds, as implied proof of instability. Sarah pounded the table. "This is a campaign of perception. If she can make you look fragile, she might sway the judge." "Then we make sure I look like fire," Margaret said, "not ash." Margaret began documenting every conversation, recording phone calls and installing backups to her camera system. Sarah coached her on courtroom language, tone, and how to reframe forgetfulness as natural aging, not incapacity. Still, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted by someone she once swaddled in a pink blanket. Jenna had declared legal war on the very woman who once stayed up for nights nursing her through the chicken pox. And for what? A house filled with ghosts? A fund built on sacrifice? Or just power? Margaret didn't know. But she did know this. She wasn't going to lose. Not quietly, and certainly not kindly. The hospital corridors smelled like antiseptic and quiet dread. Margaret sat in a stiff-backed chair across from Dr. Simone Grant, a clinical neuropsychologist with no-nonsense glasses and an even more no-nonsense expression. "This will be thorough," Dr. Grant said, folding her hands over a file. "We'll evaluate short and long-term memory, reasoning, spatial awareness, cognition under stress, and mental resilience." Margaret nodded. "Let's begin." It took 4 hours. Flashcards, math problems, scenario testing, recalling word sequences, drawing a clock, reading comprehension, logic puzzles, emotion tracking. She didn't falter once. When the results came back, Dr. Grant placed the papers down with an impressed smile. "You're as sharp as a needle, Mrs. Ellison. If more people your age scored like this, I'd be out of work." Margaret exhaled. It was the first breath in days that didn't burn. Sarah took the results and immediately filed them into the official court response. But Margaret wasn't done. "Let's record something," she said that night, pulling her phone off the kitchen counter. Sarah raised a brow. "A deposition?" "No," Margaret replied. "A confession." She hit record. The video was simple. Margaret sitting at her kitchen table, sun pouring in through the window, hair pulled back, hands resting on a worn photo album. "My name is Margaret Ellison," she began. "I'm 63. I raised my daughter on this land. I buried my husband in this town. And today, I'm defending my sanity. Not because I lost it, but because someone wants to take it from me." She spoke of love, betrayal, Jenna's deception, the fake documents, the visits that weren't about tea and company, but about inventory and manipulation. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply told the truth. And then she posted it, Facebook, YouTube, and a link on a neighborhood community group. Sarah added captions, transcripts, and contact info for legal support organizations. By morning, it had 8,000 views. By the end of the week, it had 250,000. Messages poured in. Strangers shared stories. Daughters apologized to mothers. Sons promised to do better. Retired teachers wrote notes of solidarity. Some asked how to donate to the scholarship fund. But amid the flood of kind messages, one voice stood out. Her phone rang with an unknown number. Margaret answered cautiously. "Mrs. Ellison?" A woman's voice, hesitant. "You don't know me. My name is Danielle. I used to work for your daughter." Margaret straightened. "Work?" "As a housekeeper for about 8 months. I cleaned, cooked, took care of errands." Margaret felt a knot form in her chest. "What is this about?" Danielle hesitated. "I saw your video, and I need you to know. I heard things that I didn't think made sense at the time, but now they do." Margaret clutched the phone tighter. "What did you hear?" "There was one night I stayed late after dinner. They didn't know I was in the pantry still cleaning." Scott was pacing the hallway. He told Jenna, and I quote, "We need to get her committed now before she rewrites that will again." Jenna said, "She's slipping. We just need one doctor to say the word and we're in." Then she laughed. Silence crackled over the line. Margaret's breath caught. "I didn't say anything before," Danielle continued, "because I thought maybe I misunderstood. But now, I see what's happening." Sarah took the phone. "Would you be willing to submit an affidavit? Possibly testify?" Danielle's voice quivered. "Only if you can guarantee I won't be harassed, Jenna. She's not kind when she feels threatened." "You'll be protected," Sarah promised. "I'll file for a witness protection motion through the court." After the call, Margaret stared out the window for a long time. The wind moved through the garden like a whisper. For the first time since this began, she felt the tide begin to turn. She wasn't alone anymore. Truth had a pulse, and now it had a voice. Margaret smoothed her gray cardigan, carefully choosing a pair of low-heeled shoes that made her gait look just a touch unsteady. Her reflection in the mirror was familiar, but her posture, slightly hunched, tentative, was part of the act now. "She looks vulnerable," Sarah said, watching her from the doorway. "Exactly what we need." "That's the point," Margaret replied, her voice deliberately softer than usual. "If they smell weakness, they'll come running." Plans had been laid in painstaking detail. Over the past week, Margaret had met with detectives from the Financial Exploitation Task Force. With Sarah's coordination and the cooperation of Fall Ridge Bank, they crafted a sting that would test every ounce of patience Margaret had left. The linchpin? Brandon, the soft-spoken, sharp-eyed assistant bank manager who had quietly been on Margaret's side since the first signs of trouble. "I can guide them into the meeting room," Brandon had said 2 days earlier. "Let them think it's all happening on their terms. Once they show intent, we lock it in." Margaret nodded, steeling herself. "Let's give them what they're waiting for." She had called Jenna that morning with an exaggerated tremor in her voice. "Honey, I think you're right. About everything." Jenna's silence had lasted a full 2 seconds, just long enough for excitement to curdle into calculation. "I've been forgetting things. I even left the stove on last night," Margaret continued. Maybe it's time I let someone else handle the money." Jenna's tone turned syrupy sweet. "Oh, Mom, I'm so glad you said that. It's okay. We'll take care of it. Scott and I can drive you to the bank this afternoon." At 2 p.m., Margaret sat in a small private room inside the bank. A pot of tea steamed quietly beside her. Brandon had set the table to look casual, papers laid out loosely, pens uncapped, as if nothing formal were taking place. Jenna and Scott arrived 10 minutes late, all false apologies and forced concern. "Are you feeling okay, Mom?" Jenna asked, leaning over to kiss Margaret's cheek. "You look tired." "I'm just not myself lately," Margaret replied, letting her eyes lose focus for a moment. Brandon entered, clipboard in hand. "We've prepared the temporary transfer documents just as requested. Nothing is binding until all parties agree." "Of course," Scott said, easing into the seat beside Margaret. "We just want to simplify things. Protect Mom." Brandon gave a subtle nod to the mirrored glass behind the bookshelf, where 2 officers sat, watching every movement. Jenna slid the papers toward Margaret. "Just sign here, Mom. It's just permission for us to help with bills and taxes." Margaret looked down. Her hand hovered over the pen. "Do you want me to explain anything?" Jenna asked, voice soft as velvet. "No," Margaret whispered. "I trust you." But just as she lowered the pen, Brandon's voice cut through the air. "Before we proceed, Mrs. Ellison, would you be willing to confirm this with our identity protocol?" Jenna's eyes flickered. "Protocol?" "It's a simple biometric verification. We scan the signature in real time and compare it to previous samples, standard with senior financial transactions." Scott bristled. "Is that really necessary?" Brandon smiled politely. "Bank policy." Margaret nodded. "Go ahead." She signed her name on the test form. Brandon took the sheet, scanned it into a small device, and waited. The green light blinked. Match confirmed. Then Brandon pulled out another sheet from the stack, one Jenna had accidentally inserted, and fed it through the same scanner. The machine blinked red. Margaret glanced up, eyes no longer foggy. "That's the one you brought from home, isn't it, Jenna?" Scott opened his mouth to protest, but the door behind them opened. Detectives Reyes and Murphy entered, badges flashing. Scott Witherspoon, Jenna Witherspoon, you are under investigation for attempted fraud, unlawful exploitation of an elder, and falsification of legal documents. Jenna stood abruptly. This is entrapment. It's evidence, Reyes replied, and we've been collecting it for weeks. Margaret didn't move. She sat still, hands folded, her face unreadable. For once, it was Jenna who looked old. Tired, caught. Scott glanced around the room, calculating, cornered. You think anyone will believe this? Brandon lifted his phone, replaying the video feed. They already do. And for the first time in months, Margaret felt something foreign stir in her chest. Relief. The trap had closed, but Margaret wasn't done. There was one final act, one last layer beneath the deception. Earlier that week, Margaret had arranged with Brandon to open her safe deposit box quietly, just long enough to place something inside. Not money, not documents, but memory. Inside the velvet pouch sat a delicate gold necklace, the one Richard had given her on their 20th anniversary, a small ruby at its center. Jenna had once begged to wear it to prom, and Margaret had said, someday, when it's yours, by right. That day never came. Now it served another purpose. Scott didn't know it was bait. When the officers paused to confirm charges and take statements, Brandon made a final note. Mrs. Ellison, shall we proceed to your deposit box to finish revoking third-party access? Margaret nodded. Yes, and I'd like them to come along so they see there's nothing left to take. Reyes allowed it. Scott and Jenna followed behind, hands no longer cuffed but closely shadowed by the second officer. Inside the vault room, Brandon opened the drawer and slid it out onto the table. Margaret looked over her shoulder. Go ahead, she said to Scott. Take one last look. Scott's eyes narrowed. He stepped forward, glancing inside, at legal documents, family photos, and the ruby necklace resting gently on the black velvet. No alarms, no cameras visible. He reached in as if to straighten a paper, and with a subtle sleight of hand tucked the necklace into his coat pocket. Margaret said nothing. Not yet. Minutes later, they were back in the conference room. Papers complete. Accusations formal. It was almost over. Then Reyes turned to Margaret. Anything else before we finalize the reports? Yes, Margaret said quietly. She looked directly at Scott. Check his coat pocket. Scott flinched. What? Left side, Margaret added. Reyes gestured. The officer stepped forward. Scott began to protest, but one tug revealed the necklace, still warm from his hand. Really? Reyes said flatly. You couldn't help yourself. It's hers, Scott barked. She said I could have it. Margaret met his eyes. I said no such thing. Jenna's composure crumbled. God, Scott, she snapped. Are you serious right now? He whirled on her. You're the one who wanted this whole circus. I told you it was a bad idea, but no. You said, she's losing it, just smile and nod. You dragged me into this, Jenna's voice rose. Don't you dare throw me under the bus. I should have recorded you, he spat. Every time you said we'd tuck her away and take care of it all quietly. The officers didn't interrupt. Letting them implode was more effective than any interrogation. Margaret sat silently, watching the collapse. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a printed email from Jenna. Subject line, let's get this over with. She read aloud. If she won't hand it over willingly, we'll push the memory angle. No judge wants an old lady to burn through a house she doesn't need. The bank is soft. Scott will talk to Brandon. Jenna froze. You went through my email? You sent it to my old address by mistake. Margaret lied. I never deleted it. Reyes took the paper, scanned it, nodded. That's enough. Brandon cleared his throat. There's something else, he said quietly. I didn't say anything before. I should have. Scott offered me $5,000 in cash if I would fast-track their access. I refused, but I should have reported it then. Reyes turned to the officer beside her. Get all 3 processed. 3? Jenna blinked. Brandon didn't resist as they took him by the arm. Guilt was already carved across his face. As the officers led them out, Margaret felt the weight settle in. Not relief, not triumph, but a hollow ache behind her ribs. Jenna turned just before the door. "You ruined your own legacy," she spat. "No one's going to remember you as anything but bitter and broken." Margaret didn't flinch. "And you'll be remembered as what? The daughter who forged trust with a signature?" Silence answered. Once the room was empty, Margaret sat down, covering her face with both hands. Her shoulders trembled, not from fear, not from victory, but grief. Because beneath every false smile Jenna had ever given her, there had once been a real one. And that was the one Margaret had spent a lifetime loving. She didn't cry for the betrayal. She cried for the death of the girl she once knew. The courthouse steps felt warmer under Margaret's feet than they had that morning. The sun had broken through the clouds as if to acknowledge the verdict just delivered. Not only had she retained her legal autonomy, but Jenna and Scott were now officially charged with fraud, conspiracy, and attempted exploitation. The media had been slow to catch on at first, just another family squabble with too much paperwork. But once the video confession went viral and Danielle's testimony became public record, the narrative shifted. This wasn't just about one mother, it was about hundreds. The settlement came quietly. Fallridge Bank, eager to save face, issued a formal apology and transferred a substantial sum to Margaret under a confidentiality agreement. She didn't want headlines. She wanted something to last. And so, Elder Truth Alliance was born. The name was Henry's idea. He said it sounded strong, not pitiful. Sarah helped draft the nonprofit framework, and Margaret, for all her reluctance with computers, recorded a second video, this one inviting others to tell their stories. "If this happened to you," she said to the camera, seated again at her kitchen table, "you are not foolish, you are not weak, you are not alone." Donations trickled in, then poured. Within 3 weeks, the fund had doubled beyond its initial goal. Margaret turned down media interviews, but approved a feature article in a regional paper titled "The Widow Who Fought Back." Volunteers joined the cause. Retired lawyers, social workers, even college students eager to audit legal documents for the elderly. They set up a 24-hour hotline. Within the first month, they'd taken over 400 calls. Each voice was a version of her own story. "My son tricked me into refinancing the house. My niece used my Social Security checks. My caregiver took out credit cards in my name." Margaret read every intake report, not out of obligation, but because each one confirmed what she already knew. What happened to her wasn't rare. It was epidemic. She spent her afternoons in the modest office the nonprofit leased, 2 blocks from the courthouse, a folding table, a laptop, fresh flowers from the local nursery. She didn't want marble or glass. She wanted action. One afternoon, while sorting paperwork, a young woman named Claire entered the office. Barely 23, with short cropped curls and a messenger bag slung across her shoulder. "Mrs. Ellison?" Claire asked. "You probably don't remember me. You spoke at my high school 6 years ago, career day. I wanted to be a teacher because of you." Margaret blinked, then smiled. "I'm honored." Claire's voice grew firm. "And now I want to be a lawyer because of you again." They sat, shared coffee, and talked about advocacy, power, and what happens when good people stop assuming someone else will speak up. Margaret left the office that day with a sense she hadn't felt in years, not just of justice, but of momentum. That weekend, a retired judge sent a handwritten letter. "You reminded me why I took the bench. Thank you." The mayor's wife donated printing equipment. Local businesses offered free consultations for the elderly every Thursday. The ripples were small, but real. Margaret didn't do it for revenge. She never uttered Jenna or Scott's names in any public statement. When reporters pushed, she'd say, "This isn't about them, it's about us, all of us." And in those words, people heard something rare. Clarity without bitterness. She became, quietly, a symbol. Not because she had shouted the loudest, but because she had refused to stay silent. In the charred remains of her trust, something stronger had grown, something that bloomed in ashes. The final court date arrived with the weight of inevitability. Margaret sat quietly in the front row, dressed in navy, her hands resting calmly on her lap. Around her, the room buzzed with reporters, attorneys, and spectators. The cameras weren't allowed inside, but their presence outside had turned the courthouse into a stage. At the defense table sat Jenna. Her once perfectly styled hair was now tied back loosely. Her eyes were hollow, makeup muted, the sharpness gone from her posture. She looked smaller somehow, shrunk by consequence. Scott had already accepted a plea deal. Brandon too. But Jenna had held out, hoping for a lesser charge, perhaps even sympathy. But today she stood before the judge and admitted guilt. Her voice cracked. I forged the document. I pressured my mother. I knew it was wrong, but I told myself it was necessary. We were in debt. I didn't know what else to do. The judge asked if she had anything else to say before sentencing. Jenna turned hesitantly toward Margaret. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Mom, I'm sorry. I don't expect forgiveness. I have nothing left." Margaret didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched. The courtroom seemed to lean in. Then Margaret stood. She didn't speak loudly, but every word pierced the air like glass underfoot. "When you were a child," she began, "you clung to me in thunderstorms. You'd hide behind my legs, ask me if monsters were real. I told you no. I told you you were safe." Jenna's chin trembled. Margaret continued, "When you needed love, I gave you all I had, my time, my health, my dreams. I sold your father's bonds so your husband could chase his." She paused. "And when I needed trust, you took what was left." Jenna's eyes brimmed with tears. "I'm not angry anymore," Margaret said. "Anger is something you burn. What I feel is ash." The judge called for order, then delivered the sentence. Probation, mandatory restitution, and community service with strict oversight. It wasn't the harshest outcome, but it was permanent. It would follow Jenna wherever she went. Margaret didn't look back as she left the courtroom. The past would stay behind her now. She returned home that afternoon under soft gray skies. The air smelled like lilacs. A breeze moved through the garden, swaying the swing that still hung from the old oak. Inside, the house was quiet, but not empty. She made tea, sat in her favorite armchair, and lifted a photo from the mantel. Her and Richard, arms around each other, faces full of sunlight, and a life not yet tested. "I did it," she whispered. "Not the way we planned, but I did it." A knock came at the door. Margaret rose cautiously and opened it. A young woman, barely 20, freckles scattered across her cheeks, stood there clutching a folder and a nervous smile. "Hi, I'm Lucy," she said. "I saw the Elder Truth video and I'm studying social work. I wondered if you needed volunteers." Margaret stared for a long moment, heart swelling. "We always need help," she said finally, stepping aside to let the girl in. Lucy entered slowly, eyes wide as she took in the house. Margaret poured a second cup of tea, and for the first time in a long time, the silence felt warm, not empty, just full of room for something new.